The winter of 1884 came down on the Colorado Territory like a hammer striking iron, hard and without mercy. And it was the night Maggie Hart discovered her lamp had gone dry that she first pressed her cold fingers against the frosted windowpane and wondered, genuinely and with a quiet terror she refused to speak aloud, whether she was going to survive it alone. Maggie Hart was 26 years old, a widow of 8 months, and the keeper of a small homestead parcel of land 40 minutes by horse from the nearest town of Caldwell Creek. She had brown hair the color of creek mud after rainfall, and eyes that were neither quite green nor quite gray, and a jaw that people who knew her well described as stubborn, and people who did not know her described as proud. Both were right. She had come out to Colorado with her husband, Daniel Hart, 2 years prior, full of the particular hope that infects people who have read too many letters from relatives who went west and survived. Daniel had been a kind man, a thin man, a man who coughed more than he should have and laughed more than most, and he had died of a fever in the March of that year without ever seeing the wheat they planted break the surface of the earth. He left Maggie with a small timber house, a water well that worked when it wanted to, a mule named Biscuit who was ornery beyond all reason, and a lamp that needed oil. The lamp was important. In a house without electricity, which was every house in that part of Colorado in 1884, the lamp was the difference between doing things and sitting in darkness. Maggie used it to read. She used it to sew. She used it to chase away the feeling that the prairie was pressing against the walls. And when the first real cold of November hit and the temperature dropped so fast that the water in the basin by the door froze solid before she could carry it to the stove, she opened the oil tin she kept on the shelf above the hearth and found it nearly empty. She made a trip to Caldwell Creek on a Tuesday, driving Biscuit and the small wagon Daniel had left her, bundled in every coat she owned and still cold. Caldwell Creek was not much of a town. It had a livery, a saloon, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, a sheriff's office that the current sheriff seemed to treat as an occasional suggestion, and a general store run by a man named Eli Packard who was 60 years old, mostly deaf in his left ear, and generous with credit to people he trusted. Maggie had an account there. She had been running it since spring, paying it down with the small money she made selling preserved goods and the occasional dozen eggs when her 3 remaining hens felt cooperative. She bought oil. She bought flour and salt and a small piece of cured meat and 2 candles as backup. Eli Packard wrote it down in his ledger with the careful handwriting of a man who trusted paper more than memory. Maggie paid what she could and promised the rest before December and drove Biscuit back along the frozen road with the oil tin secured in the bed of the wagon like it was something precious, because it was. She made it last. She was careful with the lamp, trimming the wick when it smoked, only lighting it when the dark was truly settled, reading by it when she could and sitting in the glow of the stove's fire when that was enough. But the oil ran out again by the middle of December, faster than she expected because the nights were longer, and the days gave so little light that even mid-afternoon felt like dusk. She made another trip to Caldwell Creek, another entry in Eli Packard's ledger, another tin of oil. The 3rd time it happened, she did not even question it. She had been stretching that tin of oil as far as it would go, and when she lit the lamp on a Thursday evening and it burned for only 20 minutes before guttering out and leaving her in solid dark, she pressed her hands flat on the table and breathed through her nose and told herself she would go to town on Friday. That was all. No panic. No tears. She had cried in the spring and the summer, and she had decided she was done with it mostly. But Friday the road was impassable. A storm had come through Wednesday night and left 2 feet of snow over everything, and the road to Caldwell Creek was a suggestion beneath white, and Biscuit looked at the drifts with an expression that made his opinion clear. Maggie could not have made it on horseback either, since she did not have a horse, only the mule, and Biscuit was not going anywhere in that. So she sat in her dark house with only the stove and told herself it was fine. She read during the daylight hours when the light through the small windows was enough, and she slept early, and she told herself she was fine. But the stove was not enough and she was not fine. And on Saturday morning when she heard boots on the porch, she was so startled, she grabbed the iron poker from beside the hearth before she even thought about it. She cracked the door open with the poker held behind her back, one hand on the doorframe, and found a man she had never seen before standing on her porch with his hat in his hands and a tin of lamp oil sitting in the snow beside his boots. He was tall in the way that men who have spent years outdoors tend to become, broad through the shoulders and lean everywhere else, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that carried 3 or 4 days of dark stubble. He looked to be about 30 years old, maybe a year or two either side of that. His coat was heavy canvas, the kind that turned weather, and his boots were good ones, worn but maintained. He had a horse tied at the post at the bottom of her porch steps, a bay with a white blaze, patient in the snow. He looked at her and then at the gap in the door and then, with a particular kind of awareness, slightly to the left of her, as though he could sense the poker she was not showing him and was making sure she knew he was not a threat. "Morning, ma'am," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man who did not use more words than a situation required. "I am Graham Whitfield. I have the spread about 2 miles east of you along the creek line. I was heading to Caldwell Creek yesterday before the storm, and Eli Packard asked me to bring this out to you since the road is not fit for wagons. Said your account was paid up and you were likely waiting on oil." Maggie stared at him. She stared at the oil tin in the snow. She was acutely aware that she had not combed her hair yet this morning and that her dress was the old wool one with the mended tear at the hem, and that she was holding a fireplace poker behind her back like something from a stage play. "Eli Packard sent you," she said. "Yes, ma'am. He told you to come all the way out here in the snow." "I did not mind the snow," Graham Whitfield said, and there was something in the simple honesty of it that made her relax the hand on the poker. She opened the door wider. "I appreciate it," she said, and she meant it without reservation, because 24 hours of sitting in the dark had cured her of any pride about accepting help. "Please come in out of the cold. I have coffee." He looked mildly surprised, as though he had expected her to take the oil and close the door, and then he bent and picked up the tin and came inside, ducking his head through the low doorframe out of habit or courtesy or both. She had the coffee on the stove in a few minutes, and she set the oil tin on the shelf with a relief that was almost physical, like setting down a weight she had been carrying. Graham Whitfield sat in the chair by the stove that had been Daniel's chair, which was the chair closest to the warmth, because she gestured at it and it was the right thing to do, and he held his hat on his knee and looked at the room without being obvious about it. "You are the widow Hart," he said. It was not quite a question. "I am," Maggie said. She poured the coffee into the 2 cups she had, which were both chipped but clean, and handed him one. "My husband passed in March. You are the Whitfield spread, you said." "I did not know anyone had taken the land 2 miles east. Took it last spring," he said. "I came out from Kansas. I have been working the herd through summer and fall and getting the house into shape." "By yourself?" He looked at the coffee cup. "Yes, ma'am." She sat in her own chair across from him and wrapped both hands around her cup, which was warm. She studied him without being rude about it, because she had learned since Daniel's death that you needed to make quick and accurate assessments of people, alone as she was out here. He was not a man who was trying to be anything. That was the first thing she noticed, and the thing she trusted most. Some men out in the territory had a performance about them, a swagger, or an eagerness that she had come to recognize as something to be cautious of. Graham Whitfield had none of that. He sat quietly in the chair with the coffee and looked back at her with dark eyes that were attentive but not intrusive, and when she asked him questions, he answered them plainly, and when he did not have an answer, he said so. They talked for nearly an hour. She found out that he was 31, that he had grown up in Kansas, that he had been a ranch hand for most of his adult life, and had saved enough to buy his own small parcel 3 years before coming to Colorado, that he had chosen the land east of her because the creek ran through it, and water access was the most important thing. He found out that she was from Ohio originally, that she and Daniel had come out 2 years ago, that she had been a schoolteacher before she married, that she had 3 hens and a mule named Biscuit who was, she said without elaborating, a character. When he left, he stood on the porch and put his hat back on and said he hoped she had a better winter, and she said she hoped so too, and he went down the steps and untied the bay horse and rode east along the creek line and disappeared into the white distance. She filled the lamp that afternoon and lit it when the dusk came, and the warm yellow light spread across the room, and she sat in it and thought about Graham Whitfield's hands around the coffee cup, which had been the hands of a man who worked hard and did not apologize for it, and she told herself she was thinking about it only because it had been a long time since another person had sat in that chair. She thought about it again before she fell asleep. 2 weeks passed. The road to Caldwell Creek cleared enough for wagon travel, and Maggie made her trip to town in the 3rd week of December, stocking up on what she could afford before Christmas. She saw Eli Packard behind the counter and she thanked him for sending Graham Whitfield out with the oil, and Eli Packard looked at her over his reading spectacles and said, "What's that now?" in the particular way he had when his left ear was not cooperating, and she said it louder and he nodded and said, "Fine man, Whitfield." Glad he could help, and moved on to calculating her total. She was not sure why she noticed, in the back of her mind, that Eli had not offered a great deal of detail about the arrangement. But she was busy counting coins and thinking about Christmas, which she was spending alone and had decided to treat as simply another day, so she did not think about it further. Christmas came and went. She made herself a small, good meal and read the Bible her mother had given her and let the lamp burn long into the evening because the oil lasted and it was a holiday. She looked at the chair by the stove and thought of Daniel, which hurt in a way that was becoming less sharp and more like a bruise you know is there without pressing on it. She thought about the year ahead, the wheat, the spring planting, whether she could afford to hire any help. She did not let herself think about Graham Whitfield, which was perhaps the reason she noticed, quite specifically, when she was thinking about him anyway. The 2nd week of January was brutal. The temperature dropped to things she did not have good language for, only that it hurt to breathe outside, and the water in the well was difficult to pull up because the rope froze between haulings. She kept the stove running as hot as she could manage, and she burned through wood faster than she wanted to, and she kept the lamp burning each evening because the dark at the windows was the kind that got inside you if you let it. She used the last of the oil on a Wednesday evening and looked at the empty tin and told herself she would get to town by Friday. But Thursday was another storm, and Friday the road was drifted over again, and Maggie sat in her dark house for the 2nd time that winter with only the stove and her stubbornness for company. Saturday morning, boots on the porch. She opened the door, and this time she did not reach for the poker. She already knew who it was, or she thought she did, and she was right. Graham Whitfield stood on the porch with his hat in his hands and a tin of lamp oil in the snow beside his boots and his bay horse tied at the post below, patient as ever. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, and she could hear something in her own voice that she would later identify as relief, not just about the oil. "Mrs. Hart," he said, "Eli Packard says your account is paid up and the road is not fit." She looked at him. She looked at the oil tin. The cold was pouring through the open door. "Come in," she said. "The coffee is on." He came in. He sat in Daniel's chair. She poured the coffee. They talked for longer this time, nearly 2 hours, because the storm outside was still going and neither of them had anywhere urgent to be. She told him about Ohio, about her parents who were both gone now, about the school she had taught in, about the 32 students who had ranged in age from 5 to 14, and who had collectively taught her more patience than she had ever expected to possess. He told her about the cattle, about the particular difficulties of wintering a herd in Colorado as opposed to Kansas, about a horse he had had for 7 years that he missed the way you miss a good friend. He told her that he had a younger sister in Kansas, named Ruth, who wrote him letters every few weeks and who had married a farmer and was expecting her first child in the spring. "You will be an uncle," Maggie said. "I will," he said, and he smiled for the first time in her presence, and it changed his face entirely, made it younger and warmer and less like a landscape and more like a room you could enter. She found herself smiling back before she decided to. He left in the early afternoon when the storm eased enough to make the ride back safe. She watched him go from the window, the bay horse picking carefully through the snow on the creek road, and she held the warm cup between her palms and admitted to herself, quietly and without a great deal of ceremony, that she had been glad to see him. More than glad. She had been glad in the way that a cold room is glad for a fire. She put the thought away carefully, like something fragile, and went about her day. January deepened. The oil lasted longer this time, because she was very careful, and also because the routine of darkness and light had become something she was managing rather than something happening to her. She made it to town in late January on a day when the cold was fierce, but the road was passable, and she stocked up on what she could, and she visited with Eli Packard at the counter. "Your man Whitfield has been coming in fairly regular," Eli said, in the conversational way of a man who is saying something he thinks is ordinary. "Picks up what he needs. Good account, that one. Pays in cash every time." "He is not my man," Maggie said mildly. Eli looked at her over his spectacles. "Did not say he was yours, Mrs. Hart. Said he comes in regular." She bought her supplies and drove home, and when she put the fresh oil on the shelf she allowed herself, just briefly, to wonder whether Eli Packard arranged things or whether Graham Whitfield arranged things and simply told Eli about them. She could not decide which possibility she preferred, and she was not sure what it meant that she was thinking about it at all. February arrived with a cold that was almost contemptuous, the kind that made the timbers of the house crack at night like small gunshots. Maggie filled every gap she could find with rags and newspaper, and she kept the stove burning day and night, using wood faster than she liked, worrying quietly about the woodpile. She was rationing the oil again. She had learned to read during the brief daylight and save the lamp for the evenings when the stove's firelight was not quite enough. She was running a little low, not critically, not yet, when she heard boots on the porch on a Saturday in the second week of February, and she opened the door before he knocked. Graham Whitfield blinked. He was standing with his hand raised and a tin of lamp oil in his other hand and an expression of mild surprise at finding the door open before he reached it. "I saw you coming from the window," Maggie said. She was, she noticed, trying not to smile and not entirely succeeding. "I'm either predictable or you have good eyes," he said. "Both," she said. "Come in." This time she had biscuits on the stove, not because she had expected him, she told herself, but because she had been going to make them anyway. He sat in the chair and she sat in hers, and they had coffee and biscuits and they talked, and outside the February wind drove snow against the windows like sand, and inside the lamp was warm and the stove was hot and the room was smaller than it had been all winter. She asked him about Kansas, about what made a man leave a place he knew well for a place he did not know at all. He was quiet for a moment before he answered, which she had come to recognize as him thinking rather than avoiding, and then he said, "I suppose I wanted something of my own, not just wages, something I could look at and say that I built it." She understood that completely and said so. He looked at her with the attentive directness that was particular to him and asked whether she intended to stay on the land after winter or whether she was thinking of going back to Ohio. "This is my land," Maggie said. "Mine and Daniel's. He is buried in the corner of it. I am not going anywhere." He nodded once slowly as though she had answered something he needed to know. "I thought as much," he said. "You seem like the kind of woman who stays. Is that a compliment?" "It is the most sincere kind I know how to give," he said, and his voice was even and unadorned, and she felt it land somewhere under her breastbone in a way that startled her with its specificity. She looked at the fire in the stove and then at the window and then at her coffee cup in that order, and when she looked up he was looking at the fire, which gave her a moment she was grateful for. He stayed longer that day, nearly 3 hours. When the storm eased in the early afternoon, he stood and put his coat on and his hat, and at the door he paused and said, without turning all the way around, "I will check on you again if the weather turns, if that is agreeable." "It is agreeable," she said. He went down the steps and mounted the bay horse and rode east, and she watched until the white of the land swallowed him up, and then she went back inside and sat in her chair for a while without picking up anything to read or sew or do, and listened to the sound of the house settling and the fire in the stove, and thought about the way he had said she was the kind of woman who stays. She put more wood on the fire. She filled the lamp. She allowed herself to feel, with caution and with a kind of careful tenderness, that the winter did not seem quite as long as it had before. The weeks of February turned. She made 2 more trips to town when the road allowed, and on both occasions she noticed that Eli Packard had already been paid for the oil, and the way he noted it in the ledger had the slight transparency of a man trying not to draw attention to something. She said nothing about it, and Eli said nothing about it, and she drove home both times turning the thing over in her mind. She was not certain when she began to suspect. It was not one single moment. It was an accumulation, the way light accumulates in a room as the sun rises, so gradual you cannot say exactly when it stopped being dark and started being morning. It was the way Eli always seemed to know exactly what she needed and how much. It was the way the oil tin always appeared on Saturday mornings after a storm, as though someone had been watching the weather and her supply and working the timing out with care. It was the way Eli Packard, who was deaf in one ear and forgetful about faces but never about his ledger, had the oil already set aside for her without her having to ask. She began to think that Eli Packard's ledger was not the only ledger involved, but she did not say anything, partly because she was not certain, partly because she did not want to be wrong and look foolish, or be right and look ungrateful, or be right and have it stop, and she could not quite decide which of those she was most afraid of, and partly, in the truest and most honest corner of herself, because whatever was happening had given her something to look forward to on Saturday mornings, and she did not want to name it and have the name make it small. Graham kept coming. Not every week, only when the weather was bad enough that a trip to town was impossible, and she noticed that this was consistent and thoughtful in a way that told her he was paying attention to both the weather and the timing of her supply. He was not coming more than was necessary. He was coming exactly as often as the oil ran out, and the road was impassable, which was a pattern that told her things she was not yet ready to say out loud. On one of his visits in late February, a gray afternoon with a light snow falling in small dry flakes, she made soup on the stove and they ate together at the table, which felt different from the coffee and biscuits in the chairs, more ordinary and more intimate at the same time. He rolled up his sleeves to wash his bowl in the basin afterward without being asked, and she noticed his arms, which were strong and scarred in the small ways that come from working outdoors for a decade, and she looked away before he turned around. He told her that Ruth had written about the baby. She was well and comfortable and the baby was expected in March. He was quietly happy about it in the way of people who keep their joy close but do not hide it. "You should go to Kansas," Maggie said. "When the baby comes, you should go see them." He looked at her. "I cannot leave the herd. Is there no one to watch them?" "I could ask Jimmy Tate from the Haverson spread," he said slowly, as though he had not actually considered it until she said it. "He is a good hand." "Then go," she said. "Family matters." He was quiet for a moment. "I suppose it does," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made her feel he was thinking about more than Ruth and the baby, though she could not have said exactly what. He helped her split some of the remaining wood before he left that day, working through the pile on the side of the house with an efficiency and a quietness that she watched from the window, not because she needed to watch, but because she wanted to. His breath made clouds in the cold air, and the axe came down in steady, unhurried rhythm, and when the pile was done, he stacked it under the lean-to and came back to the porch to collect his hat and gloves and said, That should last you a bit, with the simplicity of a man who did something because it needed doing, and that was all there was to it. "Thank you, Graham," she said. She had used his first name without planning to, and they both noticed it, and the silence lasted just one breath longer than it might have, and then he put his hat on and said, "Any time, Maggie," and went down to his horse. She said his name out loud again, quietly after the door was closed, just to hear it. March arrived, and with it a shift in the air, still cold, still capable of misery, but carrying within it the first distant suggestion of its own eventual end. The light came back a little, the days stretching out from either side with a cautious generosity, and Maggie found herself opening the window for a few minutes in the afternoons just to smell the change in the cold. The ground was still frozen, but not with the absolute authority of February. The creek, which she could not see from the house but could sometimes hear, had been silent all winter under its ice, and she thought she could begin to detect something in its silence that was more like stillness before motion than like permanent stillness. She made a trip to town on a Tuesday when the road was clear, and the sun was actually out, genuinely out, doing something to the white of the land that made it glitter rather than simply oppress. She felt unreasonably cheerful about this. She tied Biscuit to the post outside the general store and went in and set her list on the counter for Eli Packard. Eli worked through the list. He got to the oil entry and paused with his pencil above the ledger and then said, without particular inflection, "You know, I ought to tell you something, Mrs. Hart." She looked at him. "Your account for oil this winter," he said. "It has been paid by someone other than yourself." There it was. She had half known it and had been holding the half-knowledge away from her for weeks, keeping it in the peripheral vision of her mind where things could exist without requiring a response. "How long?" she said. "Since the second delivery," Eli said. He looked slightly uncomfortable, which for Eli Packard was a minor adjustment of the eyebrows. "I should have said something sooner, I expect." "He asked me not to." She said. Eli looked at her over the spectacles. "I think you know who he is, Mrs. Hart." She stood at the counter and breathed carefully through her nose. She thought about every tin of oil on her shelf. She thought about Saturday mornings. She thought about the fire in Daniel's chair and the biscuits and the soup and the woodpile and his name in her own voice and the way he had said the most sincere kind of compliment he knew how to give. "He paid for all of it," she said. "The oil." "Every tin since November," Eli said. "Said to put it on his account and tell you it was yours." She thought about the biscuit ride home in November, with the first oil tin secured in the bed of the wagon like something precious, and how she had thanked Eli and he had said, "Fine man," Whitfield glad he could help, and how she had not thought more about it then. He had arranged all of it. The delivery in the storm, every storm after that, all of it planned and quiet and sustained across the whole winter. "What do I owe you, Eli?" she said. Her voice was even. She had not decided yet what she felt about this, or rather she knew what she felt but had not given it a name that she was comfortable with yet. "Nothing," Eli said. "Account is clear. Your regular supplies today are $1.40, same as last time." She paid for her supplies and loaded them into the wagon and drove home, and she did not think about Graham Whitfield the whole drive home, which is to say she thought about almost nothing else. She thought about what it meant to keep a woman's lamp filled through an entire Colorado winter, quietly and consistently, and without announcing it or asking for anything in return. She thought about what kind of man did that. She thought about what kind of feeling was underneath it, the careful feeling that arranges itself into months of consistent, unasked-for kindness without expectation. She thought about the chair by the stove, and the coffee cups, and the soup, and the woodpile, and the uncomplicated honesty of everything he had said and done. By the time she was home and Biscuit was in the small lean-to shed that served as a stable, she had named what she felt. She stood in the yard in the March cold with the last of the supplies in her arms, and she named it clearly and without flinching. And then she went inside and set the supplies down and stood in the middle of her room for a while. She was going to have to see him. She was going to have to say something. She waited until Saturday, not because Saturday was when she expected him to come, but because Saturday was when he had always come when she needed him, and she wondered if that pattern held now that she was not low on oil. She spent Friday cleaning the house, which she told herself had nothing to do with expectation, and which she knew had everything to do with it. She made bread on Friday evening, the good kind that took time and patience, and she set it on the shelf and went to bed and lay awake listening to the March wind, which was softer than February's wind, less hostile, more like a question. Saturday morning she heard boots on the porch. She did not reach for the poker. She did not wait for a knock. She opened the door and Graham Whitfield was standing there, and he was not carrying a tin of lamp oil. He had his hat in both hands, and he looked at her with the careful attentiveness that she had come to know well, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then she said, "I talked to Eli Packard." He did not look away. He nodded once slowly. "You paid for the oil," she said. "All winter." "Yes," he said. No explanation, no defense, no decoration. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a long moment. The March air moved between them, cold but with that suggestion of eventual warmth. He looked at his hat. He looked at the porch boards. He looked at her. "Because you were alone," he said, "and the winter was hard, and I did not like thinking of you in the dark." She stood in the doorway and felt something break open in her chest, not painfully, more like the creek ice breaking in the spring, the slow and necessary fracture that lets the water move again. "You did not like thinking of me in the dark," she repeated. "No," he said plainly. "I did not." She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "I made bread." He came in. He sat in the chair. She sliced the bread and put it on the table with butter she had been saving, and she poured the coffee, and she sat down across from him and looked at him directly and said, "I would have been embarrassed. If I had known while it was happening, I would have tried to stop you." "I know," he said. "That is why I asked Eli not to tell you." "That is a very calculated thing to do," she said. "I suppose it is," he said. He did not apologize for it. He met her eyes. "I was not trying to deceive you. I was trying to make sure you stayed warm without having to fight me about it." She thought about that. She cut her slice of bread and buttered it and took a bite and thought about it, and then she said, "Do you have feelings for me, Graham?" The directness of it surprised him. She could see it in the brief widening of his eyes, and then the settling, and then the thing that came after the settling, which was a kind of relief. "Yes," he said. "I do." "How long?" "Since you opened the door the first time with a poker behind your back and tried to look like you did not have one," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile, and she laughed for the first time in so long that the sound surprised her too. "I was trying to be cautious," she said. "You were cautious and brave at the same time," he said. "I thought that was something." She looked at him across the table, at the bread and the coffee cups, and the morning light coming through the small window, the longer morning light of March that was already different from February's grudging gray. She thought about Daniel, who she had loved and who was gone, and who she carried in the way you carry people who shaped you, not as a weight, but as a part of the ground you stand on. She thought about the difference between honoring what was gone and being afraid of what was present. "I am not easy to know," she said. "I am stubborn. I have strong opinions about things that most people think are not worth having opinions about. I'm not sure I want to be on anyone's account, financially or otherwise." "I do not want you on my account," he said. "I want to sit at your table and drink your coffee and help split your wood and come back when the storms roll in. I want to see what you plant in the spring and whether the wheat comes up." She was very still. "I am not in a hurry," he said. "I am not asking you for anything you are not ready to give. I am only asking you to tell me honestly whether there is something here that is worth being patient for." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about Saturday mornings and the lamp burning, and the way the house had felt different this winter with someone to talk to, someone who came not because they wanted something but because they did not want her to be in the dark. "There is something here," she said, quietly and carefully and true. "I think there has been for a while. I was just not sure I was ready to say so." Graham Whitfield set down his coffee cup and looked at her, and the look was the steadiest and most honest thing she had seen in a long time, and she felt it reach all the way back to whatever part of her had been keeping itself closed and careful since March of the year before. "Then I will be here," he said. "Whenever you are ready." Spring came. It came the way spring always comes to the Colorado Territory, not all at once but in pieces, offering and withdrawing and offering more than it withdrew, until one morning in April you step outside and the ground is soft and the air smells like water and growing things and the particular green urgency of the world deciding to begin again. Maggie stepped outside on such a morning and stood in the yard with her face up to the sun, which was actual sun now, not winter's pale imitation, and she breathed in and felt herself uncoil from the long tension of the cold season. She had seeds to plant. Wheat, because wheat was what she and Daniel had planned for, and she was committed to seeing it through. Some kitchen vegetables along the south side of the house where the soil would warm fastest. She had been planning the layout all winter, sketching it on paper by the lamp in the evenings, and now she walked the yard with the sketch in her pocket and looked at the dark earth that was beginning to show through the patches of last snow, brown and wet and alive with the smell of everything beginning. Graham Whitfield came by on a Saturday in early April, not with oil this time, with his hat and his horse and a question about whether she needed any help breaking the ground for planting. He was matter-of-fact about it, the same uncomplicated directness he brought to everything, and she said yes without the war she might have had with herself about it in February or January. She was learning to receive things gracefully. She was learning that receiving gracefully was its own form of strength. They worked the ground together over 2 weekends in April, Graham with a borrowed plow and his bay horse, Maggie directing the lines of the beds from her sketch and working the turned soil with the rake. It was good physical work, and they did it alongside each other in a comfortable way that she thought, watching him guide the horse through the soft earth, was the way you worked with someone you trusted, not the self-consciousness of strangers, the ease of people who have already been through something together. In the evenings after the work they ate at the table and talked, and the talking was getting deeper and more various, moving through the ordinary surface things and into the things underneath. She told him about what it had been like to watch Daniel get sick, the slow, terrifying trajectory of it, the particular grief of losing someone before they were fully gone, the long months of hoping, and the single terrible morning of not hoping anymore. She had not told that story to anyone, not from beginning to end, not with all the parts that were hardest to say, and she told it to him and he listened without flinching, and without offering solutions or comfort that would have been the wrong kind, just listened and was present, and when she was done said, "He was lucky to be loved that well." She cried a little. Not the crushing grief of the spring before, not the grief of acute loss, but the softer kind that is more like acknowledgement, like saying, yes, this happened and it mattered, and it is in me and I am still here. Graham sat across the table and let her cry without making it into a problem, and afterward she made more coffee and they talked about Ruth's baby, who had arrived in March, a boy named Thomas, and Graham had gone to Kansas for a week in mid-March to meet him and come back looking pleased in the private, quiet way of someone who has been given something they did not realize they were missing. "He is very small," Graham said about Thomas. "Ruth says they all are at first. He has very serious eyes for someone 3 weeks old." "He has your eyes," Maggie said. "Ruth's eyes," Graham said. "Dark like mine, but Ruth's expression in them, serious and then suddenly not at all." Maggie smiled. She liked hearing about Ruth and Thomas. She liked that he had gone, that she had encouraged him to go and he had taken it, that he came back and told her about it. "You are a good uncle," she said. "I have barely begun," he said. "I intend to be better." Spring deepened into late April and then May, and the wheat came up. It came up slowly and then suddenly, the way wheat does, and Maggie stood in the field one morning with her hand shading her eyes and looked at the green beginning to cover the brown earth and felt a complicated joy that had Daniel in it and also something new in it, something forward-looking and warm, and she let herself feel both without trying to separate them. Graham came by every week now. They did not have a formal arrangement about it. but both of them knew it was happening, and neither of them pretended otherwise. He came on Saturday afternoons, and sometimes he stayed for the evening meal, and sometimes he did not, and the rule seemed to be whatever felt natural, and what felt natural was more and more often staying. He was careful with her, not in a nervous way, not in a way that suggested he was holding back because he was afraid, but in the way of someone who understood the value of the thing and did not want to rush it into something other than what it was. They went to town together once in May, which was the first time anyone in Caldwell Creek saw them together outside the general store context, and Maggie was aware of the particular attention of a small town that notices things. She was also aware that she did not especially mind it, which was itself a piece of information about where she was. Eli Packard saw them come in together and said nothing except good morning, but his eyebrows made a small and satisfied movement that she was certain he thought was invisible. She bought her supplies and Graham bought his, and they drove back along the road to the creek in her wagon with Biscuit doing his best to be disagreeable about the pace. And Graham held the reins when they hit a rough patch and handed them back when it smoothed out without making a thing of it either way. And she thought, sitting beside him on the wagon seat with the May sun on her face and the green beginning everywhere on either side of the road, that this was what it felt like when something was right. It was a mid-May Saturday when it rained rather than snowed for the first time, a real spring rain that came in the afternoon and drummed on the roof of the house and made the windows run, and Graham was still at the table when it started, and it was so obvious that he should not try to ride home through it that neither of them made a fuss about the fact that he stayed. She made dinner properly, a chicken she had been saving, with the kitchen garden herbs she had managed to start in pots on the windowsill through the late winter, and they ate by the light of the lamp as the rain came down outside, and the house was warm and full in a way it had not been in a long time. After dinner she washed the dishes and he dried them, which was not something she had asked him to do, and which she thought about later as a small perfect thing, the way he simply picked up the cloth and stood beside her at the basin, as though it was natural to him to share the work of a life without being told. They sat by the stove afterward, which was burning low because the spring evening only needed a little heat, and the lamp was on the table, and its light reached them in the corners of the chairs. She had her mending in her hands, but she was not really doing it. He had a letter from Ruth that he had been carrying in his coat pocket, and he read her parts of it, the parts about Thomas, who was apparently growing at an indecent rate, and had begun to smile in a way that everyone in the household agreed was devastating. They laughed about it, a comfortable shared laugh in the lamplight, and when the laughter settled she was aware of him very specifically beside her in the chair, the warmth and the quiet solidity of him, and she set the mending down on her knee and looked at the lamp. "I have been thinking," she said. "Tell me," he said, "about what you said, in March. About sitting at my table and drinking my coffee and seeing what I plant in the spring." "I remember what I said," he said. "The wheat came up," she said. "I know," he said. "I was here when it did." She looked at him. He was looking at her with the steady attentiveness that had been there from the beginning, from the porch in the November storm. Only now it had everything the winter and the spring had added to it, and it was not just attentiveness anymore. It was something that looked very much like love and was not embarrassed about looking like it. "I would like you to keep coming on Saturdays," she said. "Not because the oil needs delivering, because I want you here." He leaned forward slightly in the chair toward her and said, "Maggie, I know what I am saying," she said. "I have been careful about it all winter and all spring, and I am sure of it now." "Are you sure you are not just grateful?" he said, and it was the right thing to ask, the honest, careful thing that told her he was taking this as seriously as she was. "Gratitude feels like this," she said, touching her hand to her breastbone. "And this," touching it again, "feels like something else entirely." He reached out and took her hand, the one that was not on her chest but the one in her lap, carefully and with great deliberateness, the way you take something you intend to keep, and held it in both of his and did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I have been in love with you since February at least, possibly January. There was a day in January when you told me you were not going anywhere about the land, about Daniel being buried in the corner of it, and I thought, there is the woman I want to stay near." She turned her hand over in his and laced her fingers through his. "Since January," she said. "At least," he said, "possibly November." She looked at their hands and then at his face, and then she said, quietly and without fanfare, because she was not a woman who needed fanfare, "I love you, Graham." He raised her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles, the back of her hand, the kind of kiss that was not theatrical but was somehow for that reason more real than any theatrical gesture could have been. And when he looked up, his eyes were very dark and very warm, and she thought, sitting in the lamplight with the spring rain on the roof of the house Daniel built on the land they had come to together, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Only the shape of it had been larger than she knew when she came here. "Stay for the night," she said. "It is raining too hard to ride." "I will sleep in the chair," he said. "You will sleep on the pallet by the stove," she said. "There is a spare blanket." "The pallet, then," he said, and smiled. And it was the smile that changed his face entirely, and she let herself look at it without looking away. The summer of 1884 was golden in the way that Colorado summers are when they decide to be good to you, hot and clear, and with storms that came in the afternoon and cleared by evening and left the air smelling clean. The wheat grew and ripened, and Maggie harvested most of it with help she paid for, with some of what she got from selling the first portion, a careful arithmetic that she managed with the same patient precision she had brought to 32 students of varying ages. She was going to be all right, financially. Not comfortable, not yet, but stable, and stability felt like a luxury she had not had in a long time. Graham was at the spread 2 miles east, working his cattle through the summer, and they saw each other several times a week now, sometimes in the evening when he rode over after his day's work, sometimes when she drove Biscuit along the creek road to his place, which she had now seen in full and which was modest and functional, and had the look of a place a man was making into something, not finished but pointed in a clear direction. She brought him food sometimes. He brought her things he had made or found useful, a better hinge for the lean-to door, a length of good rope, a small carved thing he had whittled from a piece of cottonwood, no particular animal or object, just a shape that was smooth and pleasant to hold, which she set on the shelf above the hearth where it stayed. In August she met Ruth for the first time, because Ruth and her husband James came out from Kansas with baby Thomas to visit Graham, and Graham brought them to Maggie's on a Sunday afternoon with a formality that made her understand how much it meant to him. Ruth was 27, a year younger than Maggie, with Graham's coloring and a directness that was clearly a family trait, and she looked at Maggie and then at her brother and back at Maggie and said, "So you are the reason he stayed in Colorado," with a warmth and a humor that immediately made Maggie like her enormously. Thomas was 4 months old and wide-eyed and serious exactly as Graham had described, and when Maggie held him, he looked up at her with an expression of grave and thorough assessment that made everyone laugh. She held him longer than she perhaps meant to, and when she looked up, Graham was watching her hold his nephew with an expression that she would think about later, lying in bed in the warm August dark, with a feeling so large she had to breathe carefully to accommodate it. Ruth took her aside in the kitchen while the men talked on the porch, Thomas asleep against her chest, and said, "He has never looked like this. He was always good, always decent, but he was alone, and I do not think he knew how alone he was." "You changed that." "He changed some things for me too," Maggie said. Ruth smiled. "I know, he told me about the oil." Maggie looked at her. "He told you." "He writes me letters," Ruth said. "Long ones, for a man who does not use more words than he needs. He told me about the storm in November and the widow on the creek road who opened the door with a poker behind her back and then made him coffee, and he said he went home and did not stop thinking about her." She shifted Thomas slightly. "He asked me what I thought about keeping her lamp filled without telling her." What did you tell him? I told him it was the most romantic thing I had ever heard of and also possibly too sneaky, Ruth said. He said he would take his chances. Maggie laughed, a full and genuine laugh, and Ruth joined her, and Thomas woke up and looked from one face to the other with that grave expression, and then, apparently deciding they were acceptable, closed his eyes again. I am glad you are here, Ruth said. I mean in Colorado, I mean in his life. So am I, Maggie said. She meant it so completely that the words were entirely insufficient, and she knew Ruth understood that. Ruth and James stayed 3 days, and on the last evening they all sat on Maggie's porch in the warm August dark and talked about nothing in particular, the kind of conversation that is really just the pleasure of being around people you like. And Thomas slept in the basket on the porch boards, and the stars over the Colorado territory were so numerous and so close that it almost felt reckless, all that beauty pressing down from everywhere at once. After Ruth and James and Thomas left for Kansas the following morning, Graham came back to Maggie's in the evening and sat on the porch with her in the chair she had dragged out from the kitchen, and they watched the last of the evening light leave the sky, and he said, "She likes you." "I like her," Maggie said, "very much." "She said you are good people," he said. "That is very generous from someone who has known me 3 days." "Ruth knows things quickly," he said. "She has always been like that." She knew she would marry James after one conversation. Took him considerably longer to come to the same conclusion, but she was patient about it. "Patience seems to run in the family," Maggie said, and looked at him sideways, and he looked back at her with a smile that changed his face. "It has its uses," he said. The September evening was warm and the stars were coming out, and Biscuit was making sounds from the linta that suggested displeasure about something, which was his baseline state, and the lamp was burning in the window behind them, visible from the porch as a soft yellow glow. And Maggie thought about November and February and March, and every Saturday morning and every cup of coffee and every small thing that had been building itself into this particular evening without her fully realizing it was building until it was already built. Graham took her hand in the dark. He did not say anything. She turned her hand over in his and held it and looked at the stars. "Graham," she said. "Yes." "Ask me something." He was quiet for a moment. She heard him breathe out slowly, the careful breath of a man who has been thinking about something and has chosen his moment. "Maggie Hart," he said. "I am a man with a modest spread 2 miles east and a horse who is considerably more graceful than your mule, and I have not much to offer beyond what I can build with my own hands and what I intend to go on building every day until I cannot any more. I am not a man who says things he does not mean, and I will not start now. Will you marry me?" She looked at the stars. She looked at the lamp in the window. She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He raised their joined hands and pressed her fingers to his lips, and she turned toward him in the chair, and he kissed her the way she had known, somehow, since the first time she saw the way he held his coffee cup with both hands, that he would, with patience and intensity, and a care that was not caution but its opposite, the care of someone who knows the value of the thing. They married in October of 1884 at the church in Caldwell Creek, on a day that was cold and bright and exactly right for the season. Eli Packard came to the wedding, though he said he was only passing through the street anyway and had stepped in by coincidence, and the look on his face when Maggie smiled at him from across the room was the look of a man who had wagered on something and won, but is too modest to say so. The sheriff came, who had a name that nobody used because they always called him sheriff even in casual conversation, and several of the neighboring spread families, including the Haverson family whose hired man Jimmy Tate had watched Graham's cattle during the Kansas trip, and Ruth sent a letter that arrived the day before the wedding and made both Maggie and Graham read it twice, which said, among other things, "I told you so, to Graham, with love." The ceremony was simple. The minister was a patient man who had married enough frontier couples to know that what mattered in these things was not the length of the words, but the steadiness behind them. Graham said his vows looking directly at Maggie without looking away, and she said hers the same way. And when it was done, the room felt different, she thought. Not larger or smaller, but more coherent, like things that had been angled slightly wrong settling into their correct positions. They drove home together in the wagon, Biscuit maintaining his customary dignified resentment, with the October sun low and orange on the plains, and the land spread out in every direction with the particular openness that sometimes felt like exposure and today felt like freedom. "Hello, Mrs. Whitfield," Graham said. She looked at him. "Hello, Mr. Whitfield," she said. He took her hand on the wagon seat and drove one-handed the rest of the way home, which was both their home now, since she had asked him to move in before winter, rather than make the 2-mile ride in the cold every day, and which he had done with the same uncomplicated practical ease he brought to everything. The first winter of their marriage was entirely different from the winter before. The house was warmer because there were two of them in it, not only in the physical sense but in the whole sense, the warmth that comes from having someone to talk to at the end of a cold day, someone to share the tasks, someone whose presence in a room changes the room's quality of being lived in. Graham kept the woodpile full. He kept the water pulled from the well each morning before the rope could freeze. He kept the stove burning at the right temperature through the night because he had an instinct for fires that Maggie told him she deeply envied. And the lamp was always full of oil. She told him once, in December of that first married winter, that she wanted to be the one to keep the lamp supplied now. She said it with specificity and a small self-consciousness that made him look at her with comprehension. "Because you want it to be yours," he said. "I want it to be ours," she said. "Both of ours. I want to be the one who fills it sometimes." He understood this perfectly because he was a man who understood things without needing them explained twice. "Then we will take turns," he said. "Yes," she said. "We will take turns." She filled the lamp that evening with the oil she had bought herself on her own account at Eli Packard's store, and she set it on the table and lit it, and the light spread across the room and across Graham reading in the chair by the stove, and she stood and looked at it for a moment before she sat down, and thought about all the things that had led to this ordinary evening, this warmth, this lamp. Spring came again, the spring of 1885, and with it everything that spring does, the ground coming back to itself, the creek running fast and high with melt, the birds arriving from wherever they had been, the green beginning its insistence under the brown. Maggie planted wheat again, more of it this time, with Graham's help and a better plan they had developed over the winter at the table with the lamp burning. She planted the kitchen garden on the south side of the house where she had planned it last year. She planted sunflowers along the fence line because she wanted them there, and because she could. In April she was certain, and in May she told Graham, and she told him in the morning over coffee at the table, the way she told him most important things, directly and looking at him. "I am expecting a baby," she said. He put his cup down very slowly and looked at her with an expression that started somewhere deep and moved upward through his face until it reached his eyes. And his eyes were doing something she had never quite seen them do, full of something she thought might be the very particular joy of the man who has wanted a thing so much and for so long and so quietly that, when it finally arrives, he cannot contain it in any ordinary expression. He came around the table and took her face in both his hands, those hands she had first noticed in the old days around a coffee cup, and kissed her forehead and then her cheek and then her lips, and when he straightened up he said, "Maggie." "I know," she said. "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" "I am very well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, but otherwise very well." He sat back down and looked at her across the table with the expression that had not yet settled into anything ordinary and probably would not for a while. "Ruth is going to be insufferable," he said. "She is going to be wonderful," Maggie said. "And you know it." "Both things," he said, and smiled the smile that changed his face, and she smiled back. And the lamp was on the table between them, burning, and the spring was happening outside the window, and the world was full of new things. The baby was born in December of 1885, on a cold, clear night when the stars were out and the lamp was burning and Graham was beside her for all of it, which was not entirely usual for the time but which he would not have been anywhere else for, and which the midwife from Caldwell Creek, a Mrs. Alvarez, who had delivered approximately 90 children in the county and had strong opinions about everything, approved of because she said she found it easier to manage everything when the husband was sensible rather than standing in the yard in a panic. Graham was very sensible. He was steady and quiet and held Maggie's hand when she needed it and stayed out of Mrs. Alvarez's way when she did not. And when the baby arrived and the cry filled the room, he made a sound that was not quite a word, something that was all breath and relief and joy. And Maggie, exhausted and trembling and luminous with the whole enormous fact of it, looked at his face and thought she had never loved anyone as clearly as she loved this man in this moment. The baby was a boy, 8 pounds in serious-eyed and with his father's dark hair, and when Graham held him for the first time, he held him with the same careful deliberateness he brought to everything that mattered, his large hands absolutely steady. "What do we call him?" Maggie said. They had talked about names through the fall, the way you talk about names before a baby is real to you, and then you meet them and sometimes the names still work and sometimes they do not. She watched Graham look at the baby, at the serious dark eyes looking back at him, and she already knew which name he was thinking. "Daniel," he said. He looked at her. "If that is right for you." She felt something move through her, not grief, not exactly, something more like love large enough to hold more than one person in it, love that could hold the past and the present without one diminishing the other. "Daniel Graham Whitfield," she said. "That is exactly right," Graham said. She wrote to Ruth that same week, and Ruth's return letter, which arrived in early January, was 12 pages long and contained so much feeling that the words seemed to press against the paper from the inside, and there was a passage near the end that Maggie kept, which said, "I always knew my brother was a good man. I did not know until you what a good man was for." The years that came after were the years that make a life, not dramatic in the way that the winter of 1884 had been dramatic, but rich in the way that only ordinary living can be, the kind of fullness that is made from repeated small things stacked up over time. They expanded the farm, slowly and carefully, Graham's cattle doing better than either of them had expected the second and third years, Maggie's wheat operation growing until she hired seasonal help for the harvest. They repaired the house and added to it a proper bedroom, a porch that ran the full length of the south side and caught the afternoon sun in summer. Daniel grew from the serious-eyed baby into a serious-eyed child, who was also, unexpectedly, tremendously funny in the private, ironic way of someone who observes everything and occasionally delivers a single sentence that makes the whole room break down. He had his father's hands and his mother's jaw and both of their stubbornness, which made for an interesting combination. In the spring of 1888, Maggie told Graham at the morning table again, and this time he was around the table and holding her face in his hands before she had finished the sentence, which was perhaps not strictly necessary since he already knew, but she did not mind at all. The second baby was a girl, born in October, with Maggie's gray-green eyes and Graham's dark hair, and a disposition that declared itself immediately as sunny and sociable and very interested in everything, which was such a complete contrast to Daniel's studied seriousness that both parents found the combination bewildering and delightful in equal measure. They named her Clara Ruth, and Ruth in Kansas received the letter announcing her namesake with what her own subsequent letter described as undignified weeping, which made everyone who knew Ruth find this very charming. Daniel was good with his sister from the beginning, which surprised Maggie a little, and which Graham said did not surprise him at all, since Daniel paid close attention to everything and had clearly decided early that Clara was interesting and worth his investment. Clara, for her part, adored her brother with the wholehearted, uncomplicated devotion of a sunny-natured second child for a serious-natured first. And the two of them together made a world that Maggie sometimes watched from the window with a feeling she still did not quite have language for, only that it was warm and large and belonged entirely to the present. The general store in Caldwell Creek continued to be run by Eli Packard until 1890, when his son Nathan came out from Missouri to help him. Eli was in his late 60s by then, and his hearing, never fully reliable, had declined further, but he was still behind the counter on most mornings, still writing in his ledger with the careful handwriting of a man who trusted paper, still looking at Maggie over his spectacles with a particular benevolence when she came in. She had told him some years ago that she knew what he and Graham had done in the winter of 1884, and he had looked at her for a long moment and then said, "I expect you deserved the oil, Mrs. Hart," using her old name without thinking, and then correcting himself, "Mrs. Whitfield, I mean," with a mild embarrassment that she told him was completely unnecessary and that she forgave him for immediately. "You were a good friend to us," she said, "both of us, before we even knew we were an us." Eli had made the small eyebrow adjustment that was his version of a deeply moved expression and said, "I try to stock what people need, Mrs. Whitfield. Sometimes what people need is not on the list." She had laughed all the way home that day. In 1891, Graham built a proper oil storage shelf in the house, a small neat thing of pine with a door that latched, mounted on the wall in the kitchen where the light could reach it. He built it on a Sunday afternoon while Daniel, who was 6, watched with great concentration and occasionally handed him things with the gravity of an assistant to an important enterprise. When it was done, he showed it to Maggie and said, "So we are never out of oil." She touched the smooth pine with her fingertips. She thought about the winter of 1884, the empty tin on the shelf above the hearth, the dark house, the boots on the porch. She thought about how far the distance was between that woman in that house and herself in this one, and how the distance was also not a distance at all but a continuous line that you could walk back along all the way to the beginning. "We have never really been out since that winter," she said. "No," he said, "but now we have a dedicated place for it. You and your practical romantic gestures," she said. He looked at her with the smile that changed his face. "I am not sure those two things can both be true." "They are always both true with you," she said. "That is specifically what I love about you." He kissed her, there in the kitchen with the new oil shelf and Daniel watching with the expression of a 6-year-old, who has determined that the current situation is adults, and therefore outside his jurisdiction, and the October light coming through the window, and the sound of Clara somewhere in the house making the determined vocal sounds of a toddler engaged in important private work. There was a morning in the spring of 1892 when Maggie stood at the open door of the house, the late April morning, and looked out across the land. The wheat was beginning. The kitchen garden was in. The sunflowers along the fence line were inches out of the ground. Daniel was at the church school in Caldwell Creek, which had recently become a proper school with a proper schoolteacher, a young woman named Miss Porter who Maggie had taken some satisfaction in meeting, one schoolteacher acknowledging another. Clara was on the porch behind her, sitting in the sun with a cat they had acquired without fully deciding to, as cats are acquired, chatting at it in the amiable and democratic way she chatted at everything. Graham was in the field, checking the wheat's progress, walking the rows in the morning light with his hat brim low against the early sun. He was 40 now, or close to it, and the years of outdoor work had made him more himself rather than less, the way some people age, more settled and more evident, the lines in his face the lines of weather and laughter and sustained attention to the world. He turned and saw her standing in the doorway and raised his hand, a simple single gesture, and she raised hers back. Clara looked up from the cat and saw her father and waved with her whole arm, as she did everything, with wholehearted commitment, and he laughed from across the field, a sound that reached Maggie on the morning air and landed exactly where it always landed, under her breastbone, in the particular place that had been waiting for it since a November storm in 1884. She thought about the lamp. She went inside and checked it, which she did every morning now by habit, the good habit of a woman who had once sat in the dark and knew what light was worth. It was full. She had filled it 2 nights ago, and there was plenty of oil on the shelf behind the latched pine door. The lamp would burn tonight and tomorrow night and many nights after that. She had not sat in the dark since the winter that changed her life. She set her hand on the lamp's glass and felt the familiar smooth cool of it and thought about everything it represented, the hard winter and the stubborn survival of it, the boots on the porch, the coffee cups, the bread, the biscuits, the soup, the woodpile, the Saturday mornings, the spring ground broken for wheat, the table and the chairs and the talks that went deep, the vows in the little church, the baby born in December, the names chosen with love for the people who had gone before. She thought about the woman she had been in November of 1884, cold and proud and alone with an empty lamp and a mule who was a character, and the woman she was in April of 1892, warm and rooted and held within a life she had made and was making still. She was the kind of woman who stayed. He had said so, and he had been right, and she was glad. Graham came in from the field in the mid-morning, boots on the porch, the sound she knew better than any other sound in the world, and the door opened and he came in with the fresh air of the spring morning on him and looked at her standing in the kitchen and said, "How does it look?" "The wheat," she said. "The wheat," he said, and came to her. "It looks like it always does this time of year," she said, "like a promise." He stood close and took her hand, the way he had taken it on that first real evening in the lamplight, carefully and with intention, and held it. "A good promise," he said. "The best kind," she said, "the kind that keeps." She looked at him, at this man who had walked 2 miles through a November storm with a tin of oil and changed the whole rest of her life, and she thought that there was no adequate way to account for the particular grace of a thing like that, the way one small act of care could set in motion a love large enough to fill a life. She was not a woman who dealt in inadequate words when silence would serve better, so she said nothing more about it. She stood in the kitchen with the lamp behind her, and the spring light coming through the window, and the sound of Clara, outside, chatting at the cat, and the wheat in the field coming up green and certain. And she held Graham Whitfield's hand in both of hers, the way he had held hers in the lamplight on that first real winter evening, and looked at him with everything she had and everything she was and everything they had made together in the years since the lamp went out, and he looked back the same way. And the house was full and warm, and the oil shelf was stocked, and the lamp would burn tonight. It would burn every night. That was a thing she knew.